Hello, it's Jade Killoran. I'm very excited to be sharing with you today the top 3 strategies for Regen Ag practices in the Southwest. So this is just my take on what seems successful in the last 4 years of on-farm trials. So I'm lucky enough to work across Victoria as a multi-species pasture researcher and also advocate. And these results are based on the last 4 years of on-farm trials. So what I think is applicable for Southwest Victoria and the Heytesbury region is revegetation, multi-species pastures, and grazing management. So these are just 3 Regen Ag strategies that are applicable for the businesses, farm businesses in the Southwest, in terms of the fact that most of them are livestock based, especially in the Heytesbury settlement. They are easy to implement on farm and also show positive results, both from a farm business level and from an environmental level as well. And they can be positive and also easily achievable short term to encourage you to keep going. So that's why these are the top 3 picks myself for the Southwest region. So let's get started. Revegetation is the first strategy. It's relatively easy to implement, and it has such a myriad of benefits for the farm business and for the farm environment. So obviously the big one is carbon sequestration from the atmosphere into the trees and shrubs. There's obviously a lot of shade and shelter available for livestock and wildlife. There's a lot of habitat in the shelter belts for wildlife. Obviously that definitely improves biodiversity, both within the plant life and the wildlife that inhabit those shelter belts. We can also rehabilitate fragile environments using these to stop erosion of various kinds across the landscape, which is very applicable in a high rainfall zone. So our shelter belts can be a really good way of managing landslips and other erosion. We also can, following on from that, improve the water cycle a lot. So in our high rainfall zone, we can reduce a lot of waterlogging by the moisture that the trees use. And we can stop some nutrient runoff by having this buffer zone near waterways and at the edges of paddocks. So we can stop that nutrient runoff, particularly from fertilised farms in the district. We can obviously improve water capture and deep storage, which is of paramount importance. And obviously we improve the habitat from a holistic sense for our wildlife, our birds and our beneficial insects, which improve our farm business resilience as well. We also, if we do put an agroforestry spin on these shelter belts, we can have some economic returns from the trees within the shelter belts by selected logging as well. So we can have quite a lot of environmental benefits that flow on to be economic benefits as well, but we can have straight economic benefits from millable trees and also potentially including fodder trees as well in these shelter belts. So there's a huge amount of good that our re-veg can do for our farming systems. In the Regen Ag projects that Heytesbury has been responsible for, which is fantastic through the district, we have 3 projects. One was a pilot project keeping carbon on the farm at the Doolan's farm, and the others were 2 much bigger projects rolling out Regen Ag strategies to 20 farms and then continuing on to 30 farms within the district. So there's a little map on the right-hand side of the screen there, which shows you the distribution. So mostly south of the highway from Warrnambool basically to Colac. So quite a wide distribution. And we wanted to adopt these Regen Ag strategies on farm, and they had to mimic a more natural system in terms of Regen Ag practices. And it's really about making the system quite holistic, so improving the health and diversity overall of the system, which includes plant, animal, soil and landscape function. So we are really looking at improving the environmental capital of the farm and the surrounding landscape. So we obviously had revegetation works in the project, but we also tried multi-species pastures, which is still relatively new to the area. We assessed compost, which has been used in the area for some time, but is obviously very useful to assess its benefits from a production and an environmental perspective in a monitoring sense. And we also tried biochar, which is a relatively new product in the area as well. So from these results, from the 2 Heytesbury projects that began in 2020, we have finished the funding in late 2022 and are currently attempting to carry these projects forwards with further funding. But our measurements were soil testing as a baseline, and then in the spring of 2021, so it was a year after we monitored our baseline, we did ending soil tests for the first Heytesbury project, and we also did visual soil assessments as well, and we've monitored for dry matter. The second project, which rolled on from the first and had 30 farms in, was more of a rollout project, just with dry matter monitoring. So we only have soil tests for the first year of these 2 bigger projects, so 2020 to 2021. We didn't see any significant response to compost or biochar, and that's from a production and a soil health viewpoint. So no real change in organic carbon or any nutrient levels in response to compost and biochar, and no real dry matter responses either. So we didn't see an economic or an environmental benefit in that short term to either of those soil amendments. But the multi-species fodders, we did see quite an improvement economically and starting environmentally as well. So the pictures behind this slide are 2 examples of multi-species fodders. We had a summer multi-species fodder on the left-hand side, which was a summer multi-species oversowed into a paddock with a rotor strip till, and that doubled our feed, and that was quite usual over the summer period. Obviously, if we're contrasting it with a ryegrass pasture, which is mostly dormant at that time, it is quite easy to double our feed, but we did see consistently that doubling of feed. But the right-hand side is also very interesting. This was an autumn multi-species contrasted with a perennial pasture base. And we used annual species most often in these mixes, and that tripled the feed on offer. Our perennial pasture base was giving us not quite 2 tonnes of biomass, and our multi-species, our autumn annual multi-species that you can see on the right-hand side of the screen there, was giving us over 6 tonnes of feed. So it was quite easy actually to triple our feed base, and obviously has a great return on investment potential for the farm. But grazing management is key, which we will talk about as well. What I like about the multi-species is they're a fairly easy way to adopt a really good Regen Ag practice on farm if you have livestock in the system. So the tenets or some of the rules around Regen Ag are on the right-hand side of your screen, and the multi-species can really help us tick those boxes. So the biggest driver of change with a multi-species mix is the diversity of the mix in comparison to a conventional pasture, and we see a huge amount of good from promoting that diversity. And we are providing fodder with the mixes, but of paramount importance as well is the protection and improvement of soil, and that is a real focus with these multi-species mixes, and that's what sets it apart from a conventional pasture base. When I'm starting off adding multi-species pastures to a farm, I'll start off with an annual mix and move towards a perennial mix as the system and soil health improves. And I'll usually start off, especially in the first year, with a 5 to 12 species blend, covering off on 4 major plant groups, which are grasses, legumes, broadleaves, and brassicas. And if we pick, say, 2 of each, that gives us quite easily 8 species without being too complicated or too expensive. And that's quite easy to do from an autumn sowing or a spring/summer sowing. What I like about the multi-species is these rules, as I said, these rules of Regen Ag on the right-hand side are quite easily covered off with the multi-species. So because we have the diversity of species, we can keep the soil covered and maintain living roots, if not year-round, for a very long part of the season. And that's of huge importance, which we will talk about a little bit later. Because of the aggressive nature of the multi-species and the fact that the diversity of the mix means they're growing for longer, we can help minimise soil disturbance because we don't have to come in and potentially go after weeds or cultivate. We have lots of deep taproots, or I have lots of deep taproots in the mixes and that really helps us with compaction as well. So we start to see a minimisation of soil disturbance because we start to take out some of the management tasks that we might otherwise have to do. Obviously, from a livestock system base, integrating livestock into these mixes is a fabulous way of making sure that they pay us back, because from a production viewpoint, they're very good in terms of quality. So we have quite a lot of good return on investment from grazing. And also diversity. Diversity is the key to multi-species mixes. So it's very easy to optimise diversity if we put these mixes in. The big change with the multi-species, fodder is one side of the equation, but activating the soil biology through the diversity of the mix is the other side. So this is really what drives change from a multi-species pasture and a regenerative sense, implementing it onto a livestock farm. So the crux of the matter is that diverse living roots support biological activity and diversity, and that's soil biology. And it's crucially important to drive a regen system with lower inputs. So the picture on the left-hand side is the liquid carbon pathway that's termed and invented by Christine Jones. And what she's describing there is the process of photosynthesis where carbon is pulled down from the atmosphere through the plant, and then it is deliberately pushed out through the root system in the form of root exudates, a carbon source for biology. So the plant deliberately trades a carbon food source to soil biology in return for the soil biology improving the supply of moisture and nutrients back to the plant. So it's a positive feedback loop, and it is a symbiotic relationship. It is determined by the plant. The plant either does this or not, and it is really important to have this happening. So while we are activating our soil biology, they do a lot of work for us in the soil, which makes our plants more productive and resilient, and our whole system from a livestock production base then more productive and resilient as well. So when the biology are activated and they have a stable food source and a diverse food source from a diverse range of plants, they start to aggregate the soil, so they improve structure because they prefer a nice, stable environment, habitat. So they actually aggregate the soil around themselves, which also helps our soil structure and our friability, especially in heavy soils in the southwest. We also tend to accumulate more carbon in these soils from the carbon exudates that are pumped out into the system, but also through the biological mass in the soil, because it is much higher than otherwise conventional pastures would have. And we start to see much more storage of moisture, both through infiltration into a more friable soil, but also storage because of an enhanced carbon level and an aggregation level. And we also see a lot more nutrient cycling as well because of the action of soil biology. So it's crucially important for nutrient cycling that our soil biology are actually active, because they do a lot of the heavy lifting in this space. So if we can really promote this system, we then start to develop a system which relies much less on human invention, and our plants actually do the heavy lifting for us. And this diversity that we can promote through the multi-species pastures is really what drives the system. So the diversity is really crucial to make this system work. When we're talking about grazing management, from a dairy farm perspective, this type of grazing management happens quite a lot in terms of high intensity, short duration grazing. So that's stock moved every 1 to 3 days, and we have to also leave a good residual. So we have to leave 1,500 to 2 tonne of residual on the pasture to enable that pasture to bounce back. So we like to see large mobs in small areas for small amounts of the time, and that is already performed to a certain extent on dairy farms. Sometimes it is or it isn't on beef or sheep farms. So it is a game changer for all levels of farming enterprises to do this if they have livestock, but also coupled with long rests. So this might be the part of the equation that may or may not be done depending on the farming system in the southwest. Sometimes we can have feed gaps where we do have to or need to get around the farm much quicker than we otherwise would like. So these long rests are quite new to the southwest, particularly in a dairy farm system where we need to maintain quality. Pushing out the rotation length to 60 to 120 days is still something that's quite new, but it does have huge benefits. So particularly with our high rainfall environments, we will reduce a lot of pugging in the winter if we can do this. We will reduce overgrazing both in the summer period when our ryegrass pastures are quite vulnerable and through the autumn and winter when we do a lot of damage while the pastures are wet. And we can reduce root pruning as well, because if we have a rotation length that is too short, we chew off pastures that are too short and we maintain roots that are not very long or very vigorous. So if we can reduce that level of root pruning, that will very much have a beneficial impact on the farming system because of the way it helps the plants bounce back after grazing. So if we do manage high intensity, short duration grazing with long rests, when it's appropriate, we will improve our pasture growth. We'll improve the diversity of that pasture growth because there's no chance for stock to cherry pick any species out of, particularly if we have mixes involved. We'll improve pasture persistence overall, and we will obviously improve soil health because it's covered and protected rather than being bare. And where the grazing management and the multi-species link really well is that we can push out the rotation length to 60 to 120 days because of the quality of the mix. So this is a bit more difficult with ryegrass pastures. These longer rests are still very much sought after with a conventional pasture base at most times of the year, but it can be difficult to maintain quality at certain times of the year with these long rests. But our multi-species pastures, because of the makeup of the mix and the fact that we have a lot of broadleaves, both legumes and high quality species like brassicas and our herbs, chicory and plantain, we do see that these mixes can be left for a long period of time before they start to degrade in quality. So linking the multi-species pastures with this adaptive grazing management can be very beneficial for the farming system. So this is just a little example that we can lengthen these rotations and maintain quality while managing our pasture base because of the diversity of species in there. So obviously this is a dairy herd. Those lovely cows have a very diverse diet. They can pick what they like out of that pasture to a certain extent, and there's a lot for them to choose from in terms of getting an appropriate mix of fibre and quality. So you can see a lot of broadleaf species in that picture, and you can obviously see that that mix is quite tall, quite advanced, but it will still be quite high quality because of the species mix within that multi-species. So that's the real secret to being able to lengthen these rotations out to that 60 to 120 days, which we normally aren't able to do. So I think from that sense, the multi-species give us real options in our livestock systems in the southwest, because our perennial ryegrass, Dairy Australia says that it is limited by daylight and heat and cold. So at certain times of the year, we just don't have enough grass in front of us to be able to manage our grazing appropriately. So the picture on the left-hand side is a very basic sketch of our ryegrass production in blue. The numbers aren't perfect, but it is just a very rough guide as to what the feed wedge looks like. Obviously quite dormant over the summer, slow to pick up in autumn, a huge feed wedge in spring, and then dropping off sharply back towards summer again. What we can do with the multi-species, this is my guess for about 6 tonnes growing a summer multi-species. I've seen 3 to 10 tonne multi-species crops in the southwest, so I've averaged production at 6 tonnes for a summer multi-species, and then about 4 to 6 tonne autumn multi-species. And this is the type of growth that they may be able to give us over the year-long period. So we can capitalise very, very much on the summer and early autumn feed wedge that these multi-species mixes will give us. So that will really help take the pressure off our ryegrass pastures in the summer. So we will have a lot more cover on the farm and a lot less grazing of those vulnerable dormant ryegrass pastures. and we will be able to rest. If we have a certain percentage of multi-species in, we'll be able to rest our ryegrass pastures and allow them to get away on the autumn break by using the multi-species strategically. So I think we can really stabilise the fodder production from a season length perspective. And by creating these opportunistic feed wedges, especially over the summer and early autumn period, we can help to reduce our overgrazing and our pugging as well. So there's a couple of ways that can happen. The summer multi-species, we obviously dry out that moisture profile over the summer and into the early autumn with moisture use by the crop. And obviously that helps us because we have dried out the bucket over the summer. We need to recharge that bucket before we start to get waterlogged. So that will help from the get-go. The aggregation of the soil biology will also help us improve our overall soil moisture bucket, the depth to which we can recharge water to, and our taproots. If we include a lot of taproots in the mix and start to open up some of these heavier soils, will also improve that bucket. So we can both dry out the profile and enable it to be a bigger bucket in terms of recharging again. So that can be very advantageous for our farms in terms of any damage that we do, particularly in the wetter periods of the year. We can also provide quality bulk feed, and we can use those, as I've said, to create those feed wedges early in the year as a strategy so that our pastures can get away from the autumn break more effectively and we don't have to graze them as soon. So we can take that pressure off our more conventional pastures. Also, because of that bulky feed, in particular, if we have cereals in the mix, oats, rye corn, etc., we can grow a lot of bulky feed quite early, and that provides us a cushion. So a cushion for our livestock to stand on so that they're not going straight through into the ground. So that biomass flotation device can be quite handy, and that's both above and below ground. So the more root systems we have in the soil, the more well structured it is. So we can use these crops to provide us with some biomass cushion so our livestock are less likely to pug in the winter. And also we can strategically sow some autumn multi-species that are quite aggressive growers and use them as sacrifice paddocks if we need to take pressure off the farm. So either putting them on some wet paddocks and grazing them early, or putting them on some drier banks and grazing those drier banks when it's very wet, and growing a large amount of biomass in a small area so that we have less ground to renovate at the end of the season. So our take-homes, revegetation is obviously a must for the southwest from a shade and shelter perspective, but primarily from an environmental habitat and carbon sequestration nutrient runoff perspective. The multi-species across Victoria and certainly across the southwest over the last 4 years of trials have been consistently productive when establishment and grazing management has been appropriate. So they're very, very advantageous to a livestock grazing system, provided they're well managed. They can also reduce reliance on quite a few inputs. So from an economic perspective, we see a lot of environmental benefits from these multi-species, but from an economic perspective, having that homegrown fodder improve across the season really helps us reduce some of our other inputs. So we have good, high quality, relatively cheap feed grown on farm, and that helps us reduce our fertiliser, our chemical, and some of our conserved fodder requirements as well. So we see a lot of good out of the multi-species from an environmental perspective and an economic perspective. And obviously it's a very viable Regen Ag technique for the southwest. Grazing management, as I've mentioned, is a very big factor for success as well. And the two coupled together, the multi-species with managed grazing and long rotations, can be a huge game changer, I think, for the southwest. So we can have our cake and eat it too, with multi-species pastures managed well, surrounded by lovely, diverse shelter belts. Thank you very much. Just quickly, while we close, this is just a little slide if you wanted to take a photo or jot some some information down. This is just a few resources particularly about multi-species pastures and regen strategies from various groups across the southwest. So obviously Heytesbury District Landcare is a key player in the southwest. There are various Regen Ag groups on Facebook. Gips Landscapes is a Gippsland podcast series with quite a few Regen Ag podcasts contained within that. If you Google Gips Landscapes, that will come up. And the North Central CMA for Central and Northern Victoria has also been doing a lot of work in this space. So quite a few resources there which might prove helpful if you're interested to know more. Okay, thank you very much.